Just start with some preliminaries about this course, but before that, just let me say it will be nice for me to, no, before anything else, let me introduce your tutors. So that is Raghunath and this is Nimani, and they are your tutors for this course. And they are very nice people, I've known them for a long time, and I think they will not shout at you or anything. So if you have any questions, you can always ask them. You can also always ask me, and you should do that, and you can also interrupt in the middle of my lectures with your questions, but try to keep the question, if you're interrupting, then try to keep the question on the thing that I'm talking about. Then don't interrupt in the middle of today's lecture with question about yesterday. Better to get that one answered separately. Okay, good. So let's start. So the subject of quantum field theory is traditionally considered very difficult. On the other hand, it's also the basis of essentially all particle physics. So anything you do in high energy physics, even any other courses that are going to be held in this school, one way or the other, they are about quantum field theory, perhaps except the group theory course. So it's the basic underlying formalism with which we understand the fundamental laws of nature. And we think of those laws as describing some fields and some associated particles. It's a bit subtle in the beginning to understand why fields should be associated with particles, but that's one of the things which we will do here. So you will actually see it happening. Okay. So why does this subject play the central role in particle physics? So for that, let's ask ourselves, how would we describe the most fundamental system in nature? So what we normally do when we say fundamental is to break matter down to its constituent parts. We find molecules, atoms. In atoms we find the nucleus. In the nucleus we find, for example, we find protons and neutrons, and then in the atom we also have electrons. And ultimately we expect that we'll reach some fundamental particles, which I think everyone here knows, that in common matter they are basically electrons and quarks. But as you probably have heard, they're not only electrons, they're similar particles to electrons called muons and tau leptons, then there are also neutrinos, and so there's a whole bunch of elementary particles. So the question is, how should we describe the dynamics of these particles? That is, okay. So plus, for example, muons or neutrinos. Then there are photons, and there are a few other particles that may come up, will not come up in much detail in the present course. Okay, so here's a bunch of particles. So how should we describe? Can everyone read what I'm writing? The question is, how should we describe their dynamics? Okay. So before we start to answer this question, let's understand what is the question. What would it mean to describe the dynamics of an elementary particle? Okay. Dynamics means essentially what will it do? What will the particle do? So if it's free, it may just propagate. If it's in contact with other particles and it comes close to them and there's some force or some interaction, then it will interact. If two particles interact, what are they likely to do? They're likely to scatter. Okay? So this is one set of questions. So scattering is one kind of question that we can ask about. Okay? But it's not the only question. Supposing I take a couple of elementary particles and put them close enough that their attraction, suppose they attract each other through some force, supposing the attraction causes them to get bound. Okay? The famous example, of course, is simplest famous example is the hydrogen atom. So you have just one proton and one electron bound to it and going around it. This we know from experiment, right? Now the proton is not really a fundamental particle. It's made of quarks. But for many purposes, you can think of it as fundamental. And if you really insist on fundamental only, then you could perhaps take an electron and a positron. Okay, these together also form a bound state very much like hydrogen. Does anyone know what it's called? Positronium. Good. So in this case, we're not interested in scattering. What would we like to know about positronium? Roughly the same things that we would like to know about the hydrogen atom. Namely, what are the energy levels? Okay, what are the possible excitations of the system? So with the hydrogen atom, you know that there are many energy levels, and because of those energy levels in all atoms, therefore, you know, we have transitions, we have radiation, we have all of chemistry, everything takes place because of those levels. So the generic question is bound states. So scattering and bound states are like two basic things that we would like to know about when we talk about elementary particles. Okay. Where do we test our ideas about scattering? Well, that's sort of obvious. We test them at accelerators, but not necessarily man-made. In some sense, the whole universe is an accelerator. Things are flying around, elementary particles are flying around. Even as I speak, muons are falling through this room, and neutrinos are also falling through this room. Okay, and some of them interact with the stuff in this room. Some muons are decaying actually right now, and neutrinos typically propagate right through. They are very weakly interacting, so they pass through. But we can measure whatever interactions they undergo with experiments. So accelerators doesn't only mean the ones that we set up in a lab. They could also be just natural ones where we test things. Just to orient myself, so have people ever, so I noticed few people looked surprised when I said muons are falling through this room. But you know, it's good if I get an honest answer. How many people heard this today for the first time? So this is the wrong way. How many people always knew this? And how many people never answer any question asked by the teacher, whatever is the question? Okay. So the point I'm making is not that, so you should not feel bad if you didn't know it, but you should feel that there's something for you to know which is really interesting. Okay. And you should have known it if you had been given this experiment in your lab course. Okay, whether here or in your previous, wherever you may have studied previously. This experiment, there's an experiment where you set up a detector which just simply looks for muon decays taking place. You don't have to produce the muons, they're coming, and you just sit there and you detect every decay of the muon, and you can measure things like its lifetime and so on from that. So it's important to keep in mind that whatever we are talking here is not some form of mathematics. It's about real world, but real world at very, very, very small scales, very fundamental. So scattering would be tested at accelerators. And now the question is, that's good, that's what experimental high energy physicists are supposed to do. We should know about it, but we are not probably in that field, most of us, so we don't do that. What would we like to do? We would like to have a theory such that in that theory we can calculate the probability or the cross-section for scattering, the rate at which scattering takes place, and then compare it with what is tested at accelerators. And if we get an answer which agrees with experiment, then our theory is correct. Then we can make new predictions, and we can basically, then we have enormous control over the system. We have enormous control over fundamental physics. From first principles, we can compute things that can actually be measured, and those things that we compute, in some way there's no more there are no assumptions. There's just one theory, and the theory doesn't have some secret boxes in it. Everything in the theory is out in the open. Let me give you a concrete example. E plus, E minus annihilation. E minus is an electron, E plus is a positron. The two can collide with each other, and for example, they can go back into, so this is a diagram that's sometimes drawn. They can perhaps go into an E plus E minus pair. If there's enough energy, they can go into, they can probably go into two photons. So not only annihilation, anything, scattering. Many possibilities. Okay, so the point I'm making is that if you have so the fundamental theory we are trying to build, which is quantum field theory, will have in it some object that describes the electron and some object that describes the positron. And to the best of our knowledge, these are not made of anything else. They are fundamental. They are ultimate building blocks. So that theory, there's nothing that you can do with it except to compute the scattering amplitude, and you get an answer. Okay? As we'll see, there's not much to be fiddled in that theory. The theory will turn out to be, it'll have a few constants which you need to fix. After that, it will produce hundreds and thousands of answers. Once you know E plus E minus scattering, you can ask about E minus scattering, or you can ask about electron muon scattering. So many questions. And for each of them, it will give you an answer. And for each of them, there's an experiment you can do. Okay? So it can only be right or wrong. And the amazing thing is that quantum field theory is a framework which is spectacularly correct. I think there is probably nowhere in science do we see something which is so correct to so much accuracy. I don't believe there's any other branch of science where you can make an experimental prediction to 8 decimal places and then do the experiment with accuracy to 8 decimal places and the decimal places all agree. We'll see that number later in this course probably. So this is a question.
That there are many fundamental particles in nature.
Yes.
We define them by the way that there are no more fundamental substitutions of these particles.
Yes.
Is there any limit on the dimensions or something like that?
On the
we are saying electron is a fundamental particle.
Yes.
Do we know any limits on its dimensions?
By dimension you mean size?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a good question. I think basically perhaps what you are asking is how can we be sure that electron is a fundamental particle?
Yeah.
Because after all, proton was also thought to be a fundamental particle. So, and moreover, if it turns out that electron is not fundamental, then maybe we have wasted our time doing all this stuff. So here's a very nice fact. See, when proton was considered fundamental, people made some kind of theories and computed scattering of protons with electrons, for example. Just treating the proton as fundamental. The answers they got were not bad at all. They were actually very good. And the reason for that is that unless you go to such a high energy that the corresponding distance is smaller than the size of the particle at which you see the substructure, if you don't go to that energy, then treating it as fundamental is good enough. Okay? This concept basically is embodied in the idea that field theory should be usually thought of as effective field theory. So maybe I made a big sales pitch for the fact that it's fundamental, and now I'm trying to say something complementary to it, that it's fundamental, but even if it's effective, it's still as good as fundamental over a wide range of energies.
What's the range of energies up to which we have access till now?
Right now. So actually, that's quite simple to answer. Whatever is the highest energy accelerator functioning today, which is the Hadron Collider, but of course Hadron Collider is colliding hadrons, not electrons. But we have reached approximately similar. The energy reached at LEP was in the GeV range. So at the GeV range, we have tested that there's no substructure. But then who knows? So we should keep an open mind. But it's very important that even keeping that open mind, we can continue to treat these as fundamental as long as we don't find any evidence to the contrary. So the breakdown of comparison with experiment in the 5th or 6th or 8th decimal place, that may tell us that there is something. That's why it's important to do such fine comparison. If we find that there's a breakdown of this comparison between theory and experiment, it means something is wrong in the theory, and that could be a sign of substructure. Actually, I would like all of you to spend a little time just thinking because I find it very puzzling that imagine a number to 8 decimal places. I find it very hard to even imagine a number to 8 decimal places. You can write it, but can you really imagine it? I mean, just imagine you change the last decimal, the 8th decimal place, you change some 7 to an 8 or 6 to a 4. Who cares, right? In our life, we never care about such things. I mean, it's like imagine if you were doing your accounts and the discrepancy was in fraction of a paisa. How much are you going to worry? You're not going to worry. But here is the thing where actually that number has a meaning. Again, I feel it might be the only place in human existence where this number has a meaning. I'm not sure, but I would like these people to contradict me if they don't agree, now or later. But it could be the only place in the entire world where such thing as 8 decimal places has any meaning at all. And the meaning it has is, there's theory, there's experiment, you can compare them. Either they agree or they don't agree, even to very high order. You can guess that such a thing is very difficult because it's easy to make a mistake in the theory as well as in the experiment. So we are assuming that all mistakes are ironed out over a long period of time, and then you can actually compare these things. Okay, let's get to the question, how do we actually do this? How do we make the theory? A fundamental fact which we have already been taught, which is that quantum mechanics is a key ingredient of physics at very small scales. If we work at small scales and we don't use quantum mechanics, we are going to get wrong answers. But quantum mechanics substitutes those wrong answers with correct answers. For example, it tells us very nicely how a very tiny harmonic oscillator will behave. It tells us in more practical terms how the hydrogen atom should behave. It gives us things like Rydberg formula for the hydrogen atom spectrum, which was already known as an empirical formula, and quantum mechanics gave the prediction of those energy levels, and they compared beautifully with the experiment. So it's very important. But you can see right away there's a slight problem with that, because when we do quantum mechanics, what do? We start by writing an equation. The Schrödinger equation, where psi is a function of x and t, space and time. And you know this is the Schrödinger equation, of course. And you know what is the physical meaning of this quantity psi. What is it? What is it? Wave function. And what does the wave function tell us? Good. Psi star psi tells us the probability of locating a particle. Good. So that means that when we write the Schrödinger equation, we have decided that we are describing a particle. Okay. So how is this equation? Sorry?
Sir, it's not a particle exactly.
Why not?
Because we are considering the wave function here.
Yes.
So at first, particle means something localized.
Yes. You raised an interesting question in quantum mechanics, but well, let's ask this question. Do electrons have a wave function? You agree, right? Everything has a wave function. But electrons, they are localized, no? We can find electrons. We can fire electrons at a screen.
Yeah,
so they must be local.
The Schweitzer interpretation is as a particle.
The wave function, if it's localized, it can be interpreted as a particle. You're correct. That means the wave function is zero everywhere except in some region. And in that region, it describes the probability of finding the particle. Very good. But still only one particle, right? Or okay, maybe it's there. Some people may have learnt many body theory. You can write wave functions for a system of many particles. In that case, the argument will be x1, x2, x3, which are the locations of all the particles. Okay. But once you write this equation, can the number of particles change? Is there any way you can think of a process? You write this equation and now imagine a process where you started with one particle but afterwards it's two particles. Let's take the example we know best, harmonic oscillator. This equation we know very well for harmonic oscillator, we know its levels. Do we ever find that something, it describes some system where the particle in the oscillator has decided to split in two particles? No. It's always one single harmonic oscillator particle. So therefore, if an experiment is going to show us that some particle hits some other particle and turns into a third particle, there's not much hope for this equation to tell us about that. So how are we going to study it? Now what we actually do in practice with this is, you may say then I'm almost arguing that you can't study scattering with this equation, but we do study scattering with this equation, but very important how we do it. We say V of x is the effective potential of some scattering center. Okay, maybe some nucleus or some atom or some stone or anything. And then we imagine that the particle whose wave function is psi is incident on that scattering center and gets scattered off. And you can do a lot of things. But we are treating then this potential as coming from some source. It's an external source, and then there's the particle. Okay, it's not very fundamental if you look at it that way. Okay, V of x is not a nice thing, because if you are doing fundamental particle physics, then where does V of x come from? What is V of x? Is a harmonic oscillator is a particle moving in a harmonic potential, right? Half kx squared. What does that potential come from? Where does it come from? Think of that. It must be some other particle, right? So, but in fact, that means that you need to study an equation which involves at the same time any number of particles. Okay, so your theory should, so limitation of this equation, to summarize, the Schrödinger equation describes fixed number of particles, and we'll see that quantum field theory is superior because it describes all possible numbers of particles. In quantum field theory, you will be able to create a state, quantum state, which has no particles, one particle, two particles, three particles, up to anything you like. Okay, that's a much more sensible description of the real world, while this provides a very limited description where we can focus on just one particle. Okay, so this is one limitation. It describes a fixed number of particles. Second limitation, which doesn't look so bad, which is that Schrödinger equation is non-relativistic. Really speaking, this equation is the quantum version of a classical equation. So we could say that this arises from a classical equation, which is very famous, P squared by 2m plus V is equal to E. Kinetic energy plus potential energy is total energy. This we know, right? If this is a classical equation, then by arguing that the correct theory is not classical but quantum, you can argue, you can't prove, but you can argue that P should be represented by a differential operator minus IH bar del, and the equation, this should be replaced with this equation, which is a differential equation for psi, and then psi is treated as the wave function of the particle, right? But if in relativity this equation is not correct, okay? In relativity things are more complicated. In fact, in relativity, even a free particle is more complicated, because for a free particle, the relation between energy and momentum is what? Good. So E squared is P squared C squared plus M squared C fourth, which I am going to write from now on as P squared plus M squared, where C is equal to 1. What are my, these are my choice of units. What are my conventions? P is actually P mu, it's P mu, P0, P1, P2. Sorry, in this equation P is this. sorry, my mistake. E squared is P vector squared plus M squared, or P mu is M squared. This is the same equation where P mu is E and P. I hope this is all familiar to everybody. I'm just writing it to establish my notation. And the metric I'm using is plus minus minus minus, which means that when I take P lower mu and I raise it to P upper mu, then the space part changes sign. That's why P mu is E squared minus P squared. So this is the same as this. But this equation is of course not the same as this, even if you put V equals 0. But it's pretty close. Okay, you know that from this I can derive that in a limit. So non-relativistic equation arises by saying that E is square root of P squared plus M squared, but let's assume that P mod is much smaller than M, so particle is slowly moving. In that case, we can take out M from here. If this is small compared to 1, then we can expand the square root. So we get approximately M plus P squared by 2M plus some corrections which we ignore. And then we say that, well, in relativity, this is interpreted as the rest energy of the mass of the rest mass of the particle is basically its energy that it has at rest. So when we compare with non-relativistic physics, this energy is the extra energy over the rest energy. So in comparing with this, we really mean E minus M. So E minus M is approximately P squared by 2M. Okay, is this comparison clear? This is how we understand that relativity goes beyond non-relativistic physics, but in the limit of slowly moving objects, it reduces to non-relativistic physics. I see people looking surprised. Is it very surprising? It should, right? Otherwise we should never use non-relativistic physics. When people build bridges, they use non-relativistic physics. Why? Because it's approximately right. Why is it approximately right when this thing is exactly right? Because when P is small, this is this, and this is the formula we use in the non-relativistic case. Okay. But it's a good start. So let's start by trying to generalize the Schrödinger equation to the relativistic case. What's the best way to generalize something? Just guess. Then see if your guess makes sense. So let's try to guess using common sense. Okay. So this was the relation between the Schrödinger equation, between the energy relation in classical non-relativistic physics and the Schrödinger equation. Actually, I should have written this because I didn't want to assume that it's a time-independent equation. Okay, so this is the correspondence. You can see from here that it's not a relativistic equation. How do you see that? It's simply not the same order in space derivative and time derivative. And what is relativity? It's nothing but a group of symmetries that rotate space and time into each other. If space and time can be rotated into each other, then we better have either a first order equation or a second order equation, but not both. This one is second order in d by dx, but first order in d by dt. So it can't be relativistic. Okay? But we can certainly find a relativistic equation without much work by taking inspiration from that last formula, or just this formula. E squared is P squared plus M squared. Okay. So take E squared equals P squared plus M squared. And let's make the substitution. E is I h bar d by dt. And P is minus h bar gradient. We know that this substitution works in converting this to a quantum equation. Of course, you need to give a lot of arguments why such a thing has to be done. This is motivated by, this is part of the quantum mechanics course, which tells you that experiments convince us that waves and particles are dual to each other, etc., etc. But finally, as an operational construction of this equation, you just need to take this one and make the substitution I've given you. So why don't we take the relativistic equation E squared equals P squared plus M squared and make the same substitution? We'll get some equation. Right? What equation do we get? So let's do it. It hardly takes any time. So we get the equation h bar squared d2 squared by dt squared minus del squared on psi equals m squared on psi. Unless I've got a sign wrong, which I think I have. Is right? This is correct. So it looks like by simple guesswork we have at least solved one of the problems of the Schrodinger equation. The two problems being, one, that it's a single particle equation, and two, that it's not relativistic. We managed to generalize it to a relativistic form. This equation has a name. Do people know what it is? Klein-Gordon. Everybody knows it. Wow. Okay. Good. Now this is still a free Klein-Gordon equation. We haven't tried to put in the analog of V of x, some potential, but it's good enough. Let's see if it describes a free particle. So according to that, psi should be the wave function that describes, such that mod psi squared describes the probability of finding a free relativistic particle in some region of space at some particular time. Good. What's the most general solution to this equation? Not very difficult. Plane wave. Very good. So general solution . So now I'm going to introduce this notation. When I write x without any indices, then I mean 3 vector x as well as time. So this is shorthand for psi of t as well as x. Okay, this we'll use consistently. So this is e to the I. If I write this as e to the I k mu x mu, again this notation, this I'm going to notate as k dot x. No vector signs over these k's, means there are k and x are 4 vectors and they are dotted according to this. So e to the I k mu x mu. It's very easy. You plug that into this and you find that it solves the equation if h bar squared k squared is equal to m squared. Right? That means I take, so this is a function of x, a trial function to solve that equation, where k mu is an arbitrary 4 vector. I don't know what it's supposed to be. I plug this into this equation and I find that k mu cannot be arbitrary, but it has to satisfy this. In that case, this is a solution of the Klein-Gordon equation. So far so good? Okay. Mathematics. What is the energy of a particle having some fixed momentum? Now you see, k is actually wave number. H bar k has units of momentum or energy. So let's just ask this question. What is the energy of a particle having some fixed momentum? Now look at this equation. This equation is h bar squared k naught squared minus k 3 vector squared equals m squared, right? So k naught is going to determine the energy. H bar times k naught is the energy and h bar times k vector is the momentum. Okay. So I find that the energy, which is h bar k naught, is equal to square root of h bar squared k squared plus m squared. Okay? Is that clear? It's not very surprising. Okay? It's what we started out to do. We started to write a relativistic equation which came from this classical equation. Okay? But in fact, if we find a solution of that equation, then that solution should satisfy the energy momentum relation that we started with. It's exactly the same in the Schrodinger equation. If I take e to the I k dot x, then I find that the energy is h bar squared k squared by 2m. Okay, it's quite the same over here, except that the formula now involves a square root. That's very important. Okay, is it all clear up to now? Good. Now, this should be with a vector sign. So now I ask the question, I fix the momentum, so that means k3 vector is fixed. So h bar k, yes. 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 No, that's the, okay, good, thank you. So that we can say it at that point when we remember that the energy was represented by this operator and momentum was represented by this operator. So you're right, I skipped that step. Let's do it. The wave function is e to the I k mu x mu. Being wave function, it solves this equation, but it could also be an eigenfunction of some operators. In particular, in a free particle, it's an eigenfunction of E as well as P. So let's find out what are its eigenvalues. So the operator E, which I'll call with a hat, which is defined to be I h bar d by dt. Okay, so let's take that operator and act on the wave function. So it's this acting on the wave function. What does d by dt give me on this? Sorry, is there a minus? No, there's a plus. Okay, good. What does d by dt give me on this? Ah, so does that answer your question? That's exactly what you asked. So thanks for asking it. On what basis do we say that the energy for this wave function is h bar k naught? Actually, it's minus of that. And the momentum eigenvalue is h bar k, where k is the parameter appearing in this wave function. Yes?
Is it not necessary that when we take c is equal to 1,
Yes.
then we also need to take h cross?
No, not at all. And in fact, I am going to take c equals 1 and I am not going to take h cross equals 1. It's not necessary. What you are saying is what is done by all textbooks. But we must keep clear in our mind that what is done by all people and what is necessary are not the same thing. I am keeping h bar because it's very useful, and I really think that c is not very useful because we could keep it could be useful, but c is basically the conversion factor between length and time units. But h bar is a much more dangerous object. H bar appears essentially in all quantum formulae. So if we want to understand quantum mechanics, we should work with h bar until we are sure that we can drop it. And one of the things you see here is that h bar is the conversion factor between the wave number of a wave and the energy and momentum. And at least I believe in a proper way of teaching quantum mechanics, one should emphasize that the wave number of a wave has nothing quantum about it. There are waves, there are water waves, they also have a k. But they don't have a p which is h bar k. That part, saying that p is h bar k, is the statement of quantum mechanics. Okay, good. So we've done this, and now we conclude. So this is the relation between energy eigenvalue and momentum eigenvalue. So we conclude that k naught minus h bar k naught, if you like, is the square root of this. But the square root is a new thing. There are no square roots in the non-relativistic case. Because there E is p squared by 2m. Here E is square root of p squared plus m squared. So there are two possible signs. Okay. Yes. Yes. No, because this is defined with minus. Here there is a minus. Very good point. I don't know the answer to that. So tell me what it should be.
It should be minus h cross.
Why?
Because it's ki downstairs, so each momentum
K is always with I downstairs and del by del x is always with I upstairs. No, but it has to be consistent. Whichever convention you use, this means minus I h bar del by del x upper I on psi, right? Now del by del x upper I pulls out K lower I, and so I get h bar K lower I on psi. Yeah. Any problems with that? I think it's okay. Because this minus I cancels the I to give 1, and d by d of this x gives me K, and h bar is just there. No. See, this is the problem. The metric we have chosen tells us how to raise and lower indices. But we don't raise or lower indices in this because x is always defined with upper indices and k is always defined with lower indices. Okay? Even if you defined it some other way, but right now this expression only uses k with lower and x with upper. You agree with that? What are we differentiating in? We are differentiating in x with the upper index. Okay? So that just takes out this. It doesn't require any raising or lowering of indices to differentiate this with respect to that because both of these have upper index. The answer is k with lower index, which I just copied down from here. So the metric doesn't enter in this calculation at all.
But k vector is a k upper, ki upper contra?
See, it doesn't matter whether it started life as ki upper or lower. In this expression, it's lower. Otherwise, I couldn't contract it. And this is the expression I'm differentiating. So this ki is minus of k with upper I. That's fine. But we are not talking about k with upper I. We are talking of k with lower I. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Good.
If you tell them that, then you
Good.
would have been plus I del.
Now I am really puzzled. Del, according to me, is, let's do it here. Del, according to me, is d partial derivative with respect to x upper I. Okay, now what else do I have to tell? Del has a downstairs, so this is the component form of this equation, yes. It has a downstairs index because if I differentiate with respect to x and x has an upper index, then that's a downstairs index.
Yeah. So your components
Yes.
are a 4 derivative upstairs.
Good point. Good point. Yes.
What derivative can you just in terms of x, y, and z, and then how your del expression looks?
That's there. That I've done. That's there. D by dx, but that's there exactly. The x upper I are x, y, and z. But I think Nimani is saying that this combination is not a nice 4-vector equation. That's your objection?
Yeah. If you take your
Good.
component,
Thank you.
all downstairs.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. No, there is no relative sign. K mu, x mu is K0, x0 plus K1, x1, K2. Okay. Let me explain something. We need a metric. The metric eta mu nu. Nimani, I'll come back and we'll fix that in a minute. Why do we need a metric eta mu nu? We don't need any metric to contract a vector like k mu with a vector like x mu. This is k0, k1, k2, k3, and this is x0, x1, x2, x3. Okay? This transforms like what is you are taught to call it a covariant vector under Lorentz transformations. This transforms like a contravariant vector under Lorentz transformations, and k mu x mu defined like this transforms like a scalar. That means it doesn't transform at all under Lorentz transformations. And for these three facts, you don't need anything about the metric. Okay? If you take a contravariant vector and a covariant vector and dot them into each other, like this, you get a Lorentz invariant. So why do we have a metric at all? The metric is needed when I want to contract a contravariant vector with another contravariant vector or a covariant vector with another covariant vector. If I'm already given mu, I can't contract something like this. Why? This, if I define it as x0 squared plus x1 squared plus x2 squared plus x3 squared, then it's not Lorentz invariant. It's just not. We can do this in tutorials or some other time, study Lorentz transformations. Therefore, I need to contract it this way. Now I notice that I never told you what is this x lower mu. I only defined x upper mu like that. I need to give you a rule to define x lower mu such that this transforms like a covariant vector. Okay? That rule is provided by the metric. So therefore this thing is eta mu nu x nu. Okay? So this is very important, that the metric is used to contract the same type of vector with itself. Same type means it should be fundamentally defined as a contravariant vector or as a covariant vector. Whatever, it doesn't have to be x. It could be x with y, x mu and y mu, both are contravariant. Then I'll have to contract them this way. But k is defined as a covariant vector. You can question why I do that. Okay, but k is defined as a, if you defined it as a contravariant vector, the formulae would be still okay, but it's more convenient to define as a covariant vector like this. In that case, this makes sense without any metric and there's no minus sign. So whoever asked me to write this out was asking the right question, that this is what you need to be clear about. Yes?
I thought vectors are vectors to talk about covariant or contravariant components of a vector.
Not really.
A dot B
Yeah.
as A naught B naught minus A vector dotted with B.
Yeah.
So we know what A vector and B vector are. They are like the same thing. They are like each other.
Yes.
A naught and B naught are like each other.
Correct.
And that's why there's a minus sign between them.
Well, the minus sign between them is because A mu and B mu as four vectors are both contravariant or both covariant. So they are different type because there are different ways they transform under Lorentz transformations. And the only way to convert from one to the other, keeping the same components up to sign, then you have to multiply by this. That's the raising and lowering rule. So coming back to this discussion, when I wrote this, it meant that, and therefore all these manipulations are correct. But Nemani's objection is that this and this together, which is what isn't this what we do in non-relativistic quantum mechanics? Doesn't combine very nicely, yes. Yeah, but it's not convenient, yeah. Yes.
For del operator is
Yes.
downstairs.
Yes.
You take them to be del P and del, the gradient operator.
Yes.
Both positive now.
Yes.
Whereas if you take P mu,
Yes.
it's downstairs, the first is positive and the second is negative.
Yes.
So P mu upstairs is
Ah.
all positive.
Okay.
Yeah, what is K naught?
Good. All right.
So this
But-
would be del mu upstairs.
That's fine, but this is okay, no?
Yeah, but this would be del mu upstairs. If you
Why?
take on the wave function,
Hmm.
because your del mu
Del means this. It can't mean anything else.
that's the three gradients.
That's the 3 gradient. And there's no 4 gradient. I've never used 4 gradient.
Yeah, but okay.
You don't like my use of...
So you can continue to use.
Okay, let's do one thing. It really doesn't matter, but let's make ourselves happy by putting it this way. This is all motivation, so it's not going to affect the remaining lectures. It's not going to make any difference to my physical conclusions. So let me make Nemani happy, because when he gets angry, he's really difficult. So I'm just going to make him happy with this. Okay. So they will do this. It won't change anything that I'm going to say. You should also focus on what am I trying to argue. I'm trying to argue that there is a square root with 2 possible signs, and this one doesn't matter. There's still 2 possible signs, right? Now, in fact, we get this equation, which is a bit nicer, so it's not very much different. Okay, so let me retrace where I was. My conclusion was that when I try to insert this wave function in that equation, and I compute the energy eigenvalues, energy and momentum eigenvalues, I get h bar k naught and h bar k3 vector. So far so good. Now actually I'm more and more convinced that this is a good convention. Good. And now if I want to fix this one, then this one is determined because of the equation. Because the equation determines that k mu is equal to m squared. So if I fix k3 vector h bar squared, then of course it determines k naught, and this is the solution. Okay. Now what's the problem with this? The problem with this is that there are two energies for every momentum. One of the energies is the positive square root, the other is the negative square root. So that means we've learned that there's a possibility of negative energy. This is really not pleasant at all. Okay? Energies should be positive. We don't have any physical way to interpret negative energy. As we'll see, field theory solves this problem by changing it, by changing the physical interpretation. So whatever looks like negative energy turns out that it's not exactly the energy of the state, and there's never any negative energy in the theory. Okay? But if I try to write Klein-Gordon equation as a wave equation analogous to Schrodinger equation, then it also has negative energy solutions. Yes?
So even when we are doing classical physics,
Yes.
we throw with the negative
Yes,
energy,
yes.
then
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm coming to that. So in classical physics, in fact, we throw away one of the signs. That's absolutely true. And in quantum mechanics also, we would like to throw away one of the signs. So let's assume we throw it away. But first, let's draw a little picture. Energy. Okay, this is nothing. This is just energy. So here's the value square root h bar squared k squared plus m squared, and here's the negative value. Okay. Now, let's notice that there's a finite distance between these, which is just twice the value of this. Okay. Now, in quantum mechanics, as against classical mechanics, I cannot throw away any possible allowed energy, because even if I put my system in this state, it may make a transition to this state. Quantum mechanics is a theory where a system will always make transitions if it has any chance to do it. And this is the key difference between classical relativistic physics and quantum relativistic physics. Namely, you can throw this away, but as soon as your system admits interactions, we don't have interactions yet, as soon as you introduce interactions, you can be sure without doing any work that this thing will be populated. See, what is it in quantum mechanical language? It's a two-state system with this state unpopulated and this state populated. But in an atom, we know that from our experience of hydrogen atom or anything else, levels are unpopulated, but put the system in a, let's say in a high temperature bath or something, it will start populating all levels with some probability, because what is quantum mechanics? Is the theory that all energies get populated with some probability. You can never keep something in one energy level except with some very artificial conditions. And as soon as interactions are introduced, then it will move to other levels. That's why all the things that happen in quantum mechanics do happen. So the same things would happen here. So we can't keep this, it's like a secret which we want to keep away in some other room, but in quantum mechanics it doesn't remain a secret. So this is the problem. Yeah, you had a question?
If stationary states are admitted by the system,
Yes.
there should be no transition between.
In a stationary state, that's fine, but as soon as you perturb a stationary state, what will it do? It will go anywhere it likes. A stationary state is a very idealized thing. You can maintain it for some time. I don't doubt that if you had a negative energy state, you could keep it unoccupied for, I don't know, maybe one day or a week or a month, but sooner or later it would catch up with you. Because quantum mechanics likes to populate, in quantum mechanics the system populates all allowed states. That's why I gave the example of the heat bath. Stationary states are of no use in a heat bath. In a heat bath nothing is stationary, everything is making transitions. So it's like that. So you can't get rid of this, cannot get rid of this. And this tells us that something new is called for. And that new thing will be quantum field theory. Historically, when these theories got developed, you see, historically there's always a lot of confusion about what one is trying to do. And then there are also a lot of experiments which push us one way or the other way. And the full structure of the theory may not become clear for a long time. So let me just make a brief historical remark that reaching such a stage, people did not say what today would be logical, that let's think of the Klein-Gordon equation not as a wave equation but as a field equation, which is what I would like to do for you next. But that's not what people did, because the Klein-Gordon field, if it exists in nature, would be a scalar field, okay? And nobody had ever detected, I think to this day nobody has ever detected a scalar field, a relativistic scalar field, so it was not something in people's mind. What is a field, by the way? A field is just a function. From this it's not very obvious why this is different from a wave function, but we'll see that it has a very different physical interpretation from a wave function. But a field as a function of space and time, well, actually we know some fields on the earth as a function of space and time. Can you think of some scalar fields? Temperature is a nice example. If you see the weather map, at any instant of time and at any point on the earth, there's a value of T of x and t, the temperature at that point, at that time. Okay? The weather report simply tells you what is going to be T of x and t prime given T of x and t and all the data which those people have. So for each point in space, they would like to tell you what is going to be the temperature at a later time. It's called weather forecast. So that's an example of a scalar field, but that's not relativistic. Okay? So it's not very interesting to think of temperature of the earth as a relativistic field. There is in fact no clear relativistic field called phi of x and t unless the Higgs particle is found. So this is not how we think of it or how people thought of it. Instead they said, well, we do know a scalar field called the scalar potential in the theory of electrodynamics, but it comes together with a vector field called the vector potential. Okay, this field is certainly very well known. Why is it well known? Well, it's experimentally observed. When you have any system which involves electrostatics or electromagnetism or just magnetism, you always see one or the other or sometimes both. In a solenoid, in a conductor, in pretty much anything. Okay, whole of electrodynamics is based on these fields. Okay, now this part of the discussion is distinct from all that came before. Later on we'll join these two strands. We have fields in nature and they are classical. Okay, and they obey some field equations. What are the field equations for these fields? They're supposed to be Maxwell equations. So here are Maxwell equations. Temporarily I am taking a very unphysical system where there are no charges or currents. These are not the most interesting systems, but theoretically they are very simple. And I must be taking some choice of units which and of course these are in free space and all that. So these are Maxwell's equations. The reason I am bringing up this discussion is that this is a guide how to think about fields. Okay, because it's the most familiar field in nature. It's not the simplest field to study in field theory. In fact, it's the least simple perhaps in a way, but it's the one that is most commonly found in nature. And the reason for that is that it's a long range, it involves a long range force, and you have macroscopic bodies carrying large amounts of charge. If nature was only full of isolated objects with one unit of charge, you would never know. But we have objects which have millions and billions of units of charge, because you can take a conductor and load it with lots of electrons so that it has lots of charge. Then we observe that as a classical field, and the field satisfies these equations which are called field equations. I probably missed out for something, because what is B and E, it needs to be defined in terms of phi and A. And here, not to get in trouble with my tutors, I better check my signs. So E is, sorry, already did, already? If you say so. Better? What's the popular opinion on this? It's very important physically, but I'm too sleepy to think now. This you can sort out just by thinking of a physical system. I think the second one tells you that, okay, this is embarrassing. Okay, one of them. For now, we'll fix it later. Now, E is dA by dt while B is curl of A. So, these are the basic objects. E and B are derived from these, and then E and B satisfy those equations.
The first equation, both terms are mine. Yes, sir.
All right, good. This? Okay. Excellent. Okay, now I'm sure that you all know that these equations can be collected into a relativistic form. And the relativistic form is obtained by first defining A mu to be phi and A. Okay, the 3-vector potential is combined with the scalar potential into a 4-vector A mu. Next you define F mu nu as del mu A nu minus del nu A mu. This del mu means d by d x mu, where x always has upper index. Yes, please.
The most common dimension in finite particle physics book,
Yeah.
the A with upper index,
Ah.
this is what you have represented in a scalar 3-vector form.
So then this is this. Okay, that's fine. I have no problem with that. Unfortunately, you see this minus sign can crop up in many different places, and to some extent it's a convention. In fact, I think with this convention perhaps, is this okay? This is still okay, na? It better be okay. Alright. Anyway, one thing is, it's always nice for you people to check the signs of whatever I do, and you can bring it up in tutorials or the next day. Good. So here is the relativistic 4-vector, the field strength. Okay. Then individual components of F mu nu will be either E or B. How many components does E have? 3, and B has 3. And how many components does F mu nu have? It's antisymmetric in mu and nu, you can see from its construction. So it's 4 times 3 by 2, which is 6. So 3 of those are E and 3 of those are B. I'm very scared to write down which is which, because I'll get the signs wrong again. But in spirit, I think we can do it. So we split mu or nu into either 0 or I, where I is 1, 2, 3. Okay. So then according to me, F0I is minus EI. And so what are the possibilities? Either one of these indices is 0 or neither of the indices is 0. Both can't be 0 because it's antisymmetric. So if one is 0, then the other has to be I, where I is 1, 2 or 3. So there are 3 such components, and I call those components minus EI. On the other hand, if both are non-zero, then I can call them I and J. And this one, I claim, can be rewritten epsilon ijk bk. So this defines B. Where epsilon ijk is the 3-index antisymmetric tensor with the value epsilon 1, 2, 3 is 1. So notice that this is 3 by 3 antisymmetric, so it has 3 independent components, and we have used this to put it in the form of a 3-vector B. Okay, the fact that this was required makes B actually into a pseudo vector, which is constantly said in the books. While E is a normal vector, it's just a component of F with one index 0 and one index I. So the claim is that if you make this substitution, then the following equations, del mu F mu nu equals 0, as well as this set of equations, two sets of equations are equivalent to all these Maxwell equations, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, we can count, this is one equation, right, because del dot B is a scalar. This is also one equation, so 2. This is an equation relating 3 vectors on both sides, so 3 equations. This also does that, so 3 plus 3 plus 1 plus 1, so total 8. Now let's count here. This one has a free index nu, which can take 4 values. So this is 4 equations. This has a free index mu, which also can take 4 values. So 4 plus 4. So out of those 8, you get these 8. That's the claim. Easy to check. It's very easy. Up to signs which are always troublesome, you'll basically get those equations. Okay? So now let me explain my purpose in exhibiting these equations to you. My main purpose is to point out that, okay, was it clear what is this epsilon with 4 indices? It's totally antisymmetric, so epsilon 0, 1, 2, 3 and all permutations are plus or minus 1, and anytime 2 indices are repeated, then it's 0. When am I to stop? 12, no? Okay, good. Okay. So let's focus on this equation, del mu F mu nu equals 0, and substitute F mu nu to be this. So the equation is del mu of del mu A nu minus del mu A nu equals 0. So this is one set of 4 Maxwell equations. So let's write this out. Del mu A nu minus del nu equals 0. Now the reason I've done all this exercise, these are all familiar equations, and we also know what is all the physics coming out of these equations at the classical level. It is the entire book of Jackson or whatever you study, classical electrodynamics. Anybody has not studied classical electrodynamics? I suppose at some level you have, right? People are saying no, however. Anyone saying no, really? You might as well tell, because then I'll explain it more. Okay, very good. So you all know this. So what I'm saying is these are the equations which govern all of classical electrodynamics, which is a function of space and time, which itself is a 4 vector. So it also transforms under Lorentz transformations, right? But it's a function of space and time, so it's a field. And the field is the electromagnetic field. Okay? Now look at the analogy. Does this look in any way like the Klein-Gordon equation? We just wrote a Klein-Gordon equation. Does this in any way resemble that? Okay? It does in some senses, because look at the first term. So imagine that we took a toy example where A has only 1 component instead of 4. In fact, in Lorentz gauge, so for people who know Lorentz gauge, I think this whole course is not necessary. Lorentz gauge is QFT in the next QFT course. If you know it, very good. But point is not Lorentz gauge. My point is just this, is a second order differential operator acting on the field. This is some other second order differential operator acting slightly with different contraction of indices on the field. But the whole equation has the structure of second order differential operator in space and time acting on the field. So I would say that it's similar to this equation. But here I don't want to think of phi as that phi, which is one of the components of A. I'm just saying that it's similar in spirit to an equation like this, where phi is a scalar field.
Just one problem.
Yes,
The del mu phi for 0 has an invertible operator,
yes,
but that equation does not.
true. But we are not trying to invert anything just now. You're right, absolutely. So that, okay. In fact, you have just given the argument why I don't want to start right away teaching how to study this field, because of what you just said. This field involves a lot of subtleties because it's a vector field, but this kind of field, even if you just think of it as a toy example, it has much less of subtlety. So at least the first 3-4 lectures of this course will be about this kind of field, a scalar field rather than a vector field. Okay? But what I want to stress is the following thing. This equation is a field equation. This equation is also a field equation. Yes, because I haven't said it yet. As soon as I say it will be clear to you. This is a field equation, this is a field equation. My point is that this field equation looks like the Klein-Gordon equation we wrote earlier, but with a very crucial difference. No, not the mass. The mass you can put. There's still a crucial difference. Mass indeed is a difference. You can always generalize it like this. That's not a problem. The crucial difference is something else. The crucial difference is in the physical meaning of phi of x and t. Okay? This equation mathematically is the same equation as the one I was writing down earlier, the Klein-Gordon equation, but that was a wave equation and this is a field equation. Okay, what's the difference between a wave equation and a field equation? A wave equation has a single particle interpretation, and a wave equation has, the relativistic wave equation has a well-known problem of negative energy states, which I showed you. Okay. So instead, I am proposing to study a field equation. Okay. By analogy with the electromagnetic field, I am going to study a field equation for the field phi. Okay. But now I have a converse problem. Converse problem is, what on earth can a field phi have to do with particles? It looks like I've changed the problem and I have given up particle physics. Instead of particle physics, I have switched to field physics. Correct. Okay. But now tell me what you know about this equation. This equation, Maxwell's equation, describes the electromagnetic field, but those of you who have studied it in depth know that it also describes a particular elementary particle. What particle is that? The photon. So what we learn is that if you study a field and quantize it, then at the end of the day, you get elementary particles. It's a different approach from starting with the wave equation for an elementary particle, where from the beginning you have elementary particle, but you have only one, and you have some problems, the negative energy states. So now I'll write down, therefore, what is our proposal. We give up the idea of wave equations for relativistic particles, and we were already forced to do this by two problems. One, that these describe single particles, but we know that particle interactions can be important, and two, that it had negative energy eigenvalues. These two problems. So that's why we give up. But now what I can tell you is, what do we replace it with? We replace this with the idea of field equations for relativistic fields. And what we will see very soon, I think just in the next lecture, is that not only they don't have a problem of negative energy states, arbitrary numbers of particles. And because the field will be relativistic, the particles will be relativistic. Okay? Now it's not possible for this idea to sink in until I prove to you that quantizing a field gives rise to particles. So you should think of the idea in two parts. One part of the idea is that we give up relativistic wave equations. The second part of the idea, which we have only got halfway through it right now, is that in place of it, we study fields and we try to quantize fields rather than particles. Let's see immediately one consequence of it. If we study this as a field equation, what does phi mean? Does mod phi squared mean anything? It doesn't, it's not the wave function of a particle. It's not the probability of finding a particle in space and time. So what is it? We'll find out next time. What it will turn out to be, if you like, let's give out the information in advance. It will turn out to be the operator that creates as many particles as you like. It's a different meaning. It's not a wave function. So here's the key point. Same equation, but this is no longer a wave function. Instead, it will be a quantum field. And I'll show you in the next lecture that this quantum field always creates particles of positive energy and never creates particles of negative energy. Okay? Secondly, because it creates particles, we can keep using this field to create more and more particles, as many as we like. And within this framework, we'll even be able to study how two particles can annihilate and create two other particles, for example. Which means particle-particle scattering at a fundamental level. So this is sort of the idea. In fact, if Maxwell's equations were not so hard to solve, to quantize, that would be the logical first step. And the old books used to do that, but then field theory was even more difficult subject in those days. Because that has so many technical difficulties that you lose sight of the physics. That's why I asked you to make a mental step from this hard equation to this simple one. Okay, so are there questions? Yeah.
So the difference between the field and wave function is still not
Good. Keep focusing on it. Next time you tell me if it's clear. But you got the point that I'm claiming there's a difference, right? It's not clear to you what is the difference. Fine. That's very good. You should stay in that condition till after tomorrow's lecture. And after that, ask again. Because I haven't explained in full detail what is a field. What's a wave function, I think we all know. But what is a quantum?
You define field as a function of space and time.
Classical field. But now I have not explained to you what's a quantum field. That's the point. It's really a change of point of view from the following. Let's draw a little box diagram which might make it clearer. Usual quantum mechanics says take a particle, then apply rules of quantum mechanics. What are rules of quantum mechanics? Whatever is a variable here, convert it to an operator in some way with some commutator brackets and all that, and then you get quantum particle. Starting with a classical particle. But QFT says it differently. It says don't start with a particle at all, start with a classical field. Apply the principles of quantum mechanics to that field. That's the conceptually tricky part, but we'll do it in detail tomorrow for the simplest case of free Klein-Gordon fields, and you'll see how it works. The principles are identical to what we have learnt, but we have to extend them to the case of fields from whatever we already know. End result will be a quantum field. And it will be a consequence of this that we have quantum particles. So in this approach, particles are there because fields are there. This is the step I haven't shown you today. In fact, even this step I haven't shown you today. I've just told you that there's this, and tomorrow I have to show you this passage and this result. Okay? But when we finish that, you see the end result is, in both cases, is quantum particles, or quantum mechanical relativistic particles, which is what we want. But this version is inconsistent, and this version is consistent. Okay? And that's the reason why this course is called quantum field theory and not quantum particle theory. It could have been called quantum particle theory if this method of doing things had worked. Yes.
In order to go to C,
Yes.
to what extent is this forced by relativity?
Everything is forced by relativity because this became inconsistent only because of relativity. Without relativity, this route was consistent, and that's why we study this route when we teach quantum mechanics.
No, but you could still not have multi-particle. You could not go from 1 to 2 or 3 particles.
That's true. That's another thing. So it's inconsistent as well as inadequate. But in the non-relativistic case, often we don't want to go from one particle to multiple particles. Often we are happy to consider one particle moving in a overall potential.
I meant to say that there are
We may not, may want to consider multiple, but they're also not interested in creation and annihilation of particles generally. Yes. Yes, that's true. That's true. So I agree. Okay, so good, thank you. So what I perhaps maybe was little misleading about is that if this negative energy problem was not there, then probably you could still use this approach in a framework where you have many particles and discuss interactions among them. That's many body theory. Okay? And it would be more or less satisfactory, but I think in every case this is more fundamental and more satisfactory.
No, alternately, I meant to say that perhaps you can also construct field theories which are non-relativistic, which you might be able to do for a quasi-potential idea in solid state physics, where your structures are still non-relativistic, but they are collective excitations which when quantized look like particles, but
Yes.
they are non-relativistic. So you could have a non-relativistic field theory.
Yes.
Where relativity is not the key.
Oh, you could have a non-relativistic field theory, of course, and actually that's obvious because once you have a relativistic system, it always has a non-relativistic limit. So the fact that it must have a non-relativistic system is limit is granted because anything that's traveling fast can also travel slow except photons. So it will have such a limit. So in general, this is the more powerful approach, and I think it's safe to say that today in particle physics, there is really nothing you can do, almost nothing you can do without it. And in condensed matter, also people use it where it's useful, but it's not perhaps the only approach by any means. Yes?
One thing I'm a little unhappy about is when you motivate the negative energy problem. That's very much there even in non-relativistic quantum mechanics, just that we don't talk about it.
Why do you say that?
Like given the momentum of a particle and I
Yeah.
ask what is the energy?
It's p squared by 2m.
No. Okay. So given the energy and I ask what is the
No. That's not a problem. Negative momentum is not a problem at all. Momentum is a vector. So negative momentum just means particle moving the other way. So it's the fact that energy is a square of momentum, so energy is always fine. So this problem is only there in relativity. Okay, any more questions? I think I'll sort of stop here today, otherwise. Still ask some more questions if there are. Yes.
So basically you are going from a Dirac delta to a chronicle delta to a Dirac delta.
No, why do you say that?
Because it's a field is a continuous object.
So is the wave function a continuous object?
But we always talk about a chronicle delta, right?
No.
Commutator is always chronicle delta. A diagram.
Yeah, here, that you see, whether it is Kronecker delta or Dirac delta, is not really that fundamental. As you'll see tomorrow, we'll quantize this field using Kronecker deltas by putting it in a box. It's not really the continuous or discrete nature that's so important. What is important is that here we quantize a particle and the wave function is the state of the system. Because the wave function is the eigenfunction, if you like, of the Hamiltonian or whatever. It's in the Hilbert space language, it's a state vector. While here, the field is an operator, it's not a vector. It's a completely different interpretation. That perhaps is not so clear because that's a mathematical way of putting it. But we'll see that this phi is not the wave function of anything. We'll see that very clearly. That the field which we are going to quantize is not the wave function of anything but has a different interpretation. Are there any questions? Thank you. That was very useful. Exactly. It's in fact another way to it's another problem independent of negative energy but similar. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's stop here.